Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I'm pleased to welcome the first Israeli guest on the podcast, my new friend, Yonatan Dubi. He is in the department, he's a chemistry professor at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev in Israel. Yoni, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Thank you, Robert. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Yoni, I didn't warn you, but I think you've listened to the podcast before, and know guests introduce themselves. So I've given you your title. You're a chemistry professor, and we will talk about Israeli energy politics here in just a moment. But before we do that, the routine. You've arrived somewhere. You don't know anyone. You have 60 seconds to introduce yourself. Please introduce yourself.
Okay, thank you. So first, I'm a father of four, happily remarried. That's the most important part, I guess.
Agreed.
From the professional side, I graduated in 2007. I did my PhD in theoretical physics here at Ben-Gurion University, where I now work. And then after PhD, I spent 3 years in the US, in San Diego, and then in Los Alamos, working to understand how electric currents and energy pass through very small things like molecules and layers and things like that. I came back to Israel in 2010, had a 2-year stint in an industry research project, basically trying to get ideas from nanotechnology and use them in energy conversion, which is where I learned everything I know about solar panels and calculating watts per dollar and things like that. Since 2012, I went, back to academia, and I've been there ever since. But most importantly, since I knew a little bit about solar panels, I started listening to the media about what these things can do, and I started to sense that something is wrong. And it took some time, but eventually me and together with other colleagues formed what we now call the Israeli Forum for Rational Environmentalism, which is basically an advocacy group for promoting, I would say, balanced discussion on topics of climate, energy, and the environment.
And the Israeli Forum for Rational Environmentalism, we spoke some weeks ago when we were getting ready to talking about doing this podcast. And so this is an informal group. Is it a formal group? Is it a 501? Is it a nonprofit? In the US, we have zillions of these nonprofit
we are in the
entities.
process. Yes, we are in the process of making it a formal nonprofit organization. But for now, it's basically an infrastructure setting. So basically just a group of people with a lot of know-how between us, because we have academics and we have professionals and we have lawyers and we have engineers. And so a lot of know-how between us, and we publish through public media, and we talk to policymakers and decision makers and politicians. And we talk to school kids a lot, things like that.
Gotcha. Well, so let's dive into the energy part of this, because Israel is a fascinating place. I don't pretend to be an expert. I've been there twice. I've written a little bit about Israeli energy politics. I wrote about it more recently with the Golan Heights controversy with the wind project there, with the Druze rioting opposing that wind project. Let's come back to that. But the thing that, to me, from obviously a great distance, and having been there twice and seeing how the situation has changed in Israel, I mean, I don't know a more radical change in terms of energy politics, energy resources than what's happened in Israel over the past 20 years or so. The joke has always been, oh, well, if God loved the Israelis or God loved the Jews, why didn't they give them oil, right? And they gave it all to the Saudis and the Arabs or the Muslims and not the Jews. But then 20 years or so ago, roughly, then there were big discoveries, and there have been big discoveries since then in offshore Israeli waters, massive gas deposits.
Right.
I've given the kind of the tee up on this, but walk us through, Yoni, how the recent history in Israeli energy politics.
Right. So first, let's give some numbers so people would appreciate what we're talking about. Israel is very, very small. It's about the size of New Jersey. In terms of population, we're about 9.2 million, so roughly New Jersey. In terms of area, not slightly larger than New Jersey, but not by much. And And most importantly, in terms of energy, one must consider two things which are extremely important when thinking about Israel as a Western country. First, we are an island in terms of energy. I mean, we are not physically an island, but we have no neighbors from which we can buy to, or almost no neighbors with which we can sell electricity to. So our electric grid is basically completely isolated. Two, one must appreciate that Israel is always in a unique, I would say, security situation. Politics in the neighborhood are quite, complex, and security and military issues are always top priority in Israel. And this also, of course, is related to energy policy, because Israel cannot afford substantial blackouts and lack of power.
Sure.
Right? We just cannot do that. So indeed, until maybe 14 years ago, let's go even before, till the early 2000s, Israel did not use natural gas at all.
Right.
All we had is coal. And in 2002, there was a small discovery of a reservoir called Mary Reservoir. It had about 32 billion cubic meters. Are cubic meters fine by you? Do you need to translate it to cubic feet? I just multiply by 30 or something.
Right.
But that was a small reservoir, but it gave the hint that there is natural gas in the Middle East, right? Which is a tiny pond in terms, if you compare it to the Atlantic or to the North Sea, it's, just a small pond. But it turns out there's quite a lot. And in 2009 and 10, there were two huge discoveries. One reservoir called Tamar, which has about 300 billion cubic feet, and the other one called Leviathan, which has more than 400
billion cubic meters. So just to put those in, I just looked them up. So it's Tamar and Leviathan you can convert billion cubic meters, but Tamar is about 11 trillion cubic feet, and Leviathan's 22 trillion. And then since then you've had Dolphin, the Tanin, Karish, Zeus, Athena, Hermes, and Katlan. This is those are all world-class gas deposits offshore Israel that have now changed. And in fact, there was one thing I just looked up that I think it was in February, Israel exported crude oil for the very first time, which was, I guess, gas condensate for the most part, but that's what I'm guessing. But so this backdrop of going from complete energy importation, right, including this necessity of trying to source crude globally, and not from your Arab OPEC neighbors, but then now to being one of the big players in the gas market, potentially globally, the possibility of Israel exporting gas to Egypt, so Egypt could convert it into LNG for international export. I mean, it's an amazing story, right? So but it's Noble Energy was the one that made the first discovery. Is that right?
Yes.
Right, a U.S. company.
It was a partnership between Noble Energy and a local company, and it was a game changer.
Yeah.
For the Israeli economy and for the Israeli geopolitical status. And so it took some time. I mean, these were discovered around 2009, 2010, but we only started using the gas in 2017 because of Israeli politics, which are always unique. And most of it were internal politics, because there was a huge debate on who should benefit from these gas deposits. Should it be the government, or should it be the private investors, or should it be the some combination? So this took a lot of time. But once this was settled, the infrastructure was put in place in less than a year, and we now use about 10 to 13 billion cubic meters for our own. and we export to Egypt about 5 billion cubic meters, and to Jordan about 2 or 3 cubic meters a year. And as you said, this was a game changer for two reasons. First of all, if you look at the last 2 years, you've seen huge fluctuations in gas prices and ergo electricity prices in Europe. These huge fluctuations and spot prices, which were 15x the number in 2020, and Israel's gas prices and electricity prices remained essentially constant throughout this time, which was quite amazing. This was also important because of the COVID crisis, which hit at the same time. So everything got crazy around us, but in terms of power costs and gas costs, Israel was very stable.
Right.
And more so, we were able to support our neighbors with natural gas. And Egypt buys the natural gas. Some of it is used in Egypt, and some of it is liquefied and shipped to Southern Europe, where it is where they have facilities to use that. So it really is a geopolitical game changer. And the amazing thing is that this will last for 30 years at least.
Right.
Because there's a lot of natural gas there. And you could see the implications of this in late 2021. There was a special emissary from the EU that came to Israel and sat down with the Israelis and the Egyptian delegates and told them essentially, every molecule of natural gas that you have, we will buy, and name your price, because they were trying to lose the dependency on Russian natural gas.
Right.
So they said, just name your price. And, we named our price, and it's very high. Right. And these were contracts signed for, I think, I don't remember the number, 15 or 20 years. So this is a good deal for both Israel and Egypt. Not so much for the European, but they played, a bad hand. So
right. So and that's so Israeli gas going into Egyptian liquefaction facilities for LNG export into Europe.
Yes.
Well, so let's talk about that, because this is one of the other parts that I think is really important in terms of the geopolitics that you were discussing, and that is the East Med pipeline, right? Which has been a project that has been discussed for many years, and now that Israel is a major player in gas production in the region, that there was this possibility of moving that gas through a subsea pipeline from Israel into Europe. But the Biden administration came out opposed to this. I can't I've been critical of this administration. They're the most anti-hydrocarbon administration in American history. I'm not saying that as a partisan. I think it's just obviously a plain, true statement. How important would the East Med pipeline be if Israel could, instead of going back through the Egyptian marketplace, send that gas directly into Europe? How beneficial would that be to Israel overall?
Right. So let's put some details on that. So the East Med pipeline is a long pipe.
Yeah.
And about 1,000 miles of it would be underwater.
Right.
So it's a very complicated infrastructure, and it would take at least 5 years in the making just to build the thing. And this was suggested some years ago, and it will be a partnership between Israel and Greece and Italy and maybe Turkey. And so it's a great geopolitical tool for Israel, both economically and geopolitically and politically. And indeed, it was pushed very strongly by the Trump administration, which essentially put it on the table and offered even financial guarantees. And then the Biden administration withdrew completely, said that it's unnecessary. However, in last year, an Italian company suggested that they will finance it. So it's still on the table.
Well, that's interesting. So, I mean, the other part of this that I think is important to mention with regard to EastMed is that this would be gas that would be in part owned by an American company, right? Because Chevron bought Noble. Noble Energy was the company that discovered, as I recall, Tamar and Leviathan. And so then Chevron bought Noble. So Chevron, an American company, a very large super major, would benefit from the EastMed pipeline, and yet the Biden administration came out opposed to it. So that to me is just some interesting backdrop, and because pipelines, of course, are always controversial. But they, as you say, and always geopolitically, if they're going long distances across several countries, incredibly complex in terms of the geopolitics. But the other part that to me is just as we step back a minute, Yoni, and by the way, let me just remind people, my guest is Yonatan Dubi. You can find him on Substack, hxstem.substack.com. You can also find him via the Google. He has a number of YouTube videos out there. Yonatan Dubi, D-U-B-I is how his last name is spelled. So he's easy to find. But the overall geopolitics in the Middle East have changed a lot in the last few years. Now, there's rumors of even some kind of détente between the Israelis and the Saudis, which is truly staggering. You know, but it started, of course, with the Israel and Egypt and Anwar Sadat and back when and Menachem Begin and Carter. How important is a long way of getting to the question? How important were the Abraham Accords, which were this is not directly energy related, but I think it's important to kind of put how Israel's relationships with its neighbors have changed so dramatically in the last few years. So I'll ask it again. How important were the Abraham Accords?
Well, I would say opinions differ on that.
Sure. Well, it's Israel, right? This is like
exactly, and it kind of depends
politics on
which side of the political aisle you are on. But from my perspective, unbelievably important. And they are important unbelievably important economically, important geopolitically, and important energetically. Because and I don't know how deep you want to go into the geopolitics. I mean, it has to do with the question of the Palestinian problem, and the doctrine of the American administrations up till Trump was that unless you solve the Palestinian problems, you cannot normalize the relation between Israel and the Arab world. This was the doctrine. And so all the presidents said, okay, let's first solve the Palestinian problem, which is indeed a very complicated and sensitive problem, both for the Israelis and the Palestinians, naturally. And Trump came by, and of course, Trump shook the boat. And being the non-Orthodox guy that he is, he told Jared Kushner, which was his nephew and kind of Secretary of State unofficially, told him, okay, check this doctrine. Let's see if it stands. And it turned out that it could be changed. And so they bypassed the Palestinian problem and went directly to the moderate Arab nations, the UEA and Abu Dhabi and so on, and struck a peace accord between Israel and these Arab nations, which is mostly economical. But the economic part, which is of course important, is it does two things. First of all, it allows Israel to secure to some level the import of oil, which is an important thing to any nation. Of course, about a third of our primary energy use is oil, like everyone else, every Western country. But it also was the first step for what we now see, normalization with places like Saudi Arabia.
Right.
Now, Saudi Arabia is an extremely important country in the Middle East because you cannot exaggerate in its importance, because it has its hands on the oil faucet, right? So striking a deal with the Saudis, or at least even normalizing the relations with the Saudis, would be a huge thing.
Right.
And
that seems possible now, whereas before the Abraham Accords, impossible.
For sure. For sure, it's definitely
and so just
only possible now.
One quick, because I'm no expert on geopolitics. I study them, I follow it, but the Abraham Accords, for people who are like me and not necessarily in the know on all of this. So the signatories were Bahrain, Israel, United Arab Emirates, Sudan, Morocco, and the U.S. And it was, as Yoni was saying, normalizing relationships among those countries where, and that potentially sets the groundwork then for a broader normalization of Israel with other the Arab states that it has in the past been at war with, right? So the first one was Egypt, but now Egypt is your close ally in part because of this energy trade, and Egypt is having blackouts and gas shortages as we record this, and just in the last few days, the news reports have been coming out of Egypt regarding that. So, but just let's tie the knot there back on, or just finish that discussion on East Med. So, as I hear you saying, East Med was killed, but there's now the possibility that the Italians, would it be Eni or another Italian company, would come in and take the place and say, well, we'll build it, or we'll get involved here and finance it, even though it's 1,000 miles. So this is a massively expensive project as well.
Right. It's a massively expensive project. And the problem is that now that things are in kind of an equilibrium in terms of gas prices. It's not clear that it would be economical to start selling gas in 2027, which is when it will be built.
Right.
So it's a long-term project. It's a financial risk in some sense.
Yeah.
So I would say the verdict is still out.
Right.
To Israel, it would be fantastic. It will substantiate what we call the Southeast Mediterranean Alliance. Israel, Greece, Cyprus, and Italy. It will be great for the Europeans, which need natural gas. But also within Israel, there is a discussion, do we want this or not? Because it will mean that we export more natural gas than was originally planned, which means that there will be less for domestic use.
Right.
So unless we find more natural gas in the Middle East, there will be people who are strongly against that, just because they want to keep gas use domestically and have it last not for 30 years, but for 40 years. And this is a great discussion. I mean, it's really an ongoing discussion. How much you have a natural gas reserve, how much of it you should sell and how much of it you should keep. And it's not only a financial question, because of course it relates to what would be the prices 10 years from now, but it's also in terms of Israel, a security issue, which is always troubling us.
Sure. Well, it's interesting you say that, because it's like, well, this is now not for the first time, I bet, but I'll say it. Yeah. For the first time, Israel has some measure of energy security. We want to keep it, right? We don't want to trade this, so we don't want to trade this away already. We want to make sure we play the long game, right? Because that's been a consideration since 1947, right? You're
exactly.
We're going to play the long game. We're not here. We're not just camping here. We're going to stick around.
Right. And one of the things that the Israeli Forum for Rational Environmentalism is advocating for is that 30 years should be enough, because by then we can build enough nuclear reactors.
Okay, so let's come back to nuclear. Let me just finish this discussion on gas, because this is something else that I think is really interesting, and it is I made a film. I wrote about it in my last book, and I was in Beirut and spent some time in Lebanon. And again, don't pretend to be an expert, but Israel and Lebanon have not been on good terms for a very long time, right? There's continuing cross-border skirmishes and occasional flare-ups and occasional invasions, this, what, and the other. We know all this, right? Hezbollah and the Iranians have a strong foothold in Lebanon. But it was remarkable to me that the Israelis and the Lebanese government then made an agreement on a gas sharing deal on a gas field that straddles the Israeli-Lebanese territorial waters, which to me is significant in a lot of ways because these countries have been foes for so long, and yet here's one area where they could find some agreement. How important was that?
Well, it's hard to know yet because this gas field was not yet is not producing yet.
Okay.
So we don't know, and this is, of course, it depends on how well the Lebanese government can build the infrastructure. I think there's a British company involved there. But I mean, in Hebrew we say, I mean, not from the love of Mordecai, but from the hatred to Haman. I mean, this was clearly, it's not that there is huge love between these nations.
And we'll put that as the understatement of the episode right now, Yoni. We'll just leave it there.
I've been on the fence and I've seen Lebanon many times, and it's a huge, huge tragedy what's going on in Lebanon. I have Lebanese friends for my postdoc years. It's an unbelievable tragedy. And one of the hallmarks of a fallen state is the fact that they don't have energy infrastructure. I think yesterday I read that the airport in Beirut is using generators.
Right. Yeah.
It's not connected to the grid. That's an unbelievable tragedy. And from the Israeli perspective, if there's anything we can do to stabilize the energy infrastructure and hence the economic situation, then it's also better for the Israeli side, because when the state falls apart, there's always civil unrest and turmoil. And on the other side of the fence, we're going to get rockets because Hezbollah and other political things will want to show up their strength on just for local reasons.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. And yeah, I mean, the Lebanese grid, rather, I mean, Electricité du Liban has been a mess for years, and it's made even worse since the port explosion, now 2 or 3 years ago. And but Lebanon, what did a friend of mine call it? A cocktail of the factions and the factionalism in Lebanon have been ongoing for decades, and Hezbollah exploits those factions to its own advantage. And it's a mess.
I mean, if I can share a story, when I was a postdoc, I had a good friend who's of Lebanese origin, and he told me that essentially the entire intelligentsia of Lebanon fled after the civil war. Circa 70,000 people, which is an unbelievable number of people, doctors and PhDs and things like that. And, we spoke a little bit about politics, and it says, your politicians are so great. They are so, everyone looks at their politicians and say, my God, this is, the worst kind of people. And he told me, you don't understand how bad politics are in Lebanon. It's a failed state. And this was 2010. Yeah. And since then, it keeps on deteriorating. This is, I'm telling you, this is an amazing tragedy of a place with such beautiful potential, which is just in ruins for years.
Yeah.
So Israel, of course, wants to stabilize the situation as best it can. And this was, I think, one step in that direction. And mind you, there are probably details we do not know about this agreement, which are best left unknown, I'm guessing. It's always the case in deals in the Middle East.
Right. Well, I think, failed state is the right way to think about Lebanon, and a deeply unfortunate, an amazing city, the amazing culture, amazing people, but just a mess, and the port explosion made it even worse. So let's talk. I want to talk about this. I want to talk about solar because this is your area. I want to talk about wind. And then come to nuclear. So I wrote recently on my Substack about this wind project that it's an Israeli company that is actually trying to develop it in the Golan Heights. And the Times of Israel's coverage I thought was very clear-eyed, but your Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is no shrinking violet, has originally said that he was going to allow construction on the wind project to begin again, and that has not happened. So is this an indicative of the fact that Netanyahu is realizing the Druze have a strong hand there, and they're not going to allow this wind project to be developed? That to me, this is a yet another clear example of the land use conflicts and the low power density of wind, and one of the reasons why it's not going to work at scale. That's my long preface. Tell me what's happening with the wind project in Golan and why it was so controversial.
Well, first of all, so the Golan Heights is in the border of Israel and Syria, in the northern eastern part of Israel. It's a height. It's above 800 meters on average. So there are winds there, and that's the only place in Israel where there are winds. And the potential for wind energy in Israel is very small. I mean, the total potential is assumed to be around half a gigawatt, but the numbers are in the single digit megawatts. It's very small projects,
right?
And even those are encountering a very strong opposition, and I think rightfully so. And I will explain a little bit. First of all, one of the greatest opponents of wind projects in Israel is the Israeli Society for the Preservation of Nature.
Okay.
Because Israel is a very important route of bird migration, and a lot of species of large birds and small birds, and it kills them. I mean, you know this better than I do. And so they are strong opponents, and they're an important voice in Israel. So wind power was originally limited in Israel on that basis already. And then there were a few small projects in the Golan Heights and in another small range in the Gilboa. But basically we have things like 10 or 20 wind turbines altogether. There's a very small number.
Sure.
And this new project was supposed to be the largest one. And then it turned out that there was a mixture of dishonesty and politics and money involved in all this. And it turned out that the land on which the project was supposed to be built on was sold to the company or leased to the company by private individuals from the Druze community. And so the Druze community as a whole suddenly realized, and this was all done behind their backs, and they live there.
Right.
And it's not only that they live there, they consider it their home. Right. In a very emotional way, because Druze is a unique population. They are not Muslim, they are not Jewish, and they live really at the border between Israel and Syria. Many families are divided between Israel and Syria and Israel and Lebanon, Druze families. So this is where they are. And they felt like they were being shut out. Right. And left behind and not getting anything out of this project, which is a multi-million-dollar endeavor. Yeah. And not only you're doing this on their land without talking to them, without paying them any subsidies, not even electricity subsidies. Right. And it's a huge thing. You see, I mean, these things are, big constructions. They had all the reasons to oppose this. Now, the opposition became, I would say, aggressive. Right. So the works were halted, and I think they are now still not. There's no construction that I know of. I just checked yesterday. Yeah. And the reason might be that Israel is now in a sort of a political turmoil, that we have kind of better things to do. And this kind of new equilibrium is good for everyone, except the company that invested some money already.
Right.
But honestly, if this project stops, it will not break my heart because it's just, people ask me what's wrong with wind farms in the Golan Heights. I tell them, look, it's like buying a bag of peanuts. It's not going to change your diet, but if you buy it for a ridiculous amount of money, you're just losing money. And this is what it is. It's just a huge subsidy. And we don't need this electricity. The electricity market in Israel, the grid is very strong. We have enough electricity. We need to build more gas power plants for sure, but we need gigawatts, not megawatts. Right. So it's not useful in any way.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to get your perspective on that, because once I saw, the coverage, and Al Jazeera covered it. It wasn't covered at all in the American media, not a bit. But Reuters covered it, Al Jazeera, Times of Israel covered it, and very clear-eyed, I thought, and very clear-eyed in terms of, no, these were riots. This was not just some people marching around with signs. No, these were riots, and many people were hospitalized, including Israeli policemen.
Right.
And that the Druze leaders warned Netanyahu, you do this again, and it's going to be an intifada. We will die for this. And so that to me was, I've been following these land use conflicts for a long time, and the wind industry, the solar industry, try to play them down. Oh, it's not that big of a deal, or it's funded by the hydrocarbons. No, it's not. It's a lie. These local people all around the world are reacting in very much similar ways. Now, they're not rioting in Iowa, right? But they are saying, or Ohio, but they are saying, we don't want these. Okay, so solar, you spend a lot of time working on solar. Solar, obviously, in Israel has much more purchase than wind in terms of the potential there, because you have large deserts, you have a fair amount of land. I mean, it's a fairly populous country, but it's not. You have areas that are unpopulated where you can put solar. So wind won't work at scale. Tell me about the solar situation in Israel.
Right. So solar power in Israel supplies about between 5 and 8% of the electricity. And I think in a way, Israel is a great example of why solar power just cannot replace reliable sources of power at scale. Because, as you say on paper, we are the ideal place, right? We have a lot of sun. I mean, we have, on average, over 280 days of sunshine, right? I mean, compare it to Belgium, who deployed solar panels and have about 50 days of sunshine. So, and we have large areas of unpopulated country, which is desert. So you don't even have to chop trees or anything like that. So it would seem on paper that it's an ideal place to make what I would say a large-scale experiment in deploying solar power into a Western grid.
Right.
And it fails completely. And it fails because of the physical limitations that solar power has, which you talk about a lot in your podcast, infinite amount of guests speak about it. But it's just, there are several points which are always the same. The first, of course, is that there is no power at night, and with very little possibilities of
storage and batteries.
Of storage of batteries, you're just going to have to build the infrastructure anyway to generate reliable power at night.
Right.
That's one thing. The second thing is that, but it's of course derived from this part, is that it costs more. No matter how you how you look at it, solar power always imposes extra burden on the grid, which always translates to increase in electricity costs. And in Israel, for the past 5 or 6 years, every year, the prices go up by 3%, roughly, direct subsidies into solar power. Now estimated at about 2 billion shekels. Shekel is about a quarter of a dollar annually. I mean, it's not a big amount, but Israel is a small country. So
$500 million or so per year, roughly.
Right. And this is direct subsidies. I'm not talking about indirect subsidies like maintenance of the regular grid and regular power plants and land ownership and things like that, which are all indirect subsidies. And
so for a country that's of less than 10 million, I'm just trying to do that. If we were going to extrapolate that into what would be the subsidy level in the United States. So you're 10, well, you say 10 million. So we multiply that by 30 or something like that. So you would have, just a massive number. I don't know, 30 times 500 million. What is it? It's 1,500 million, right? So that's a very large number, right?
Yes.
1.5.
Right.
1.5
and this
trillion,
is
right?
Right. And this is a yearly number.
Uh-huh.
Every year. This is it's within the energy bill of the Israeli consumer.
Yeah,
we just pay it out of our own pockets, and again, this is an underestimation because there are all kind of indirect costs, and of course, in the last, I would say, 5 years, or maybe even more, 10 years, the government is pushing to increase the number of solar power. The golden number is 30% by 2030. This is, of course, never going to happen.
Right.
And the reasons are clear. It's just not doable. I mean, the Israeli electricity company had a research. I mean, of course, in Israeli politics, everything is always backwards. So they announced
why do you say that everything is always backwards in Israeli politics? Why do you say that? That's funny.
Because Israelis are, I mean, we are not so organized in our thoughts, which is both a huge advantage and a huge disadvantage. I mean, this is why Israel is the startup nation, because it's easy for us to think outside boxes.
Uh-huh.
But then when you want to plan an energy policy, thinking too much outside the box is not a great idea, because the box is the laws of physics and engineering.
So just a quick update on my math here. I'm not doing it well in my head, but I'm double checking. So $500 million in direct subsidies to the solar sector. We extrapolate that roughly to the United States, it'd be 15 billion per year for solar, which I think our number is actually probably higher. It is definitely higher than that, but just to give a rough estimate. So anyway, I'm sorry I interrupted about this planning that you were talking about within the Israeli electric company.
Right. So they announced the program,
which is your state-controlled electric provider for everyone, right? You have one company for the whole.
You have one company now. Now it's partially privatized, so we have about half the power is generated by the Israeli electricity company and half by privately owned
power companies. Yeah.
Power companies, yes. But we have an ISO, right? We have an independent system operator, which is
that's deeply unfortunate. But go ahead.
Well, they're actually not that bad in Israel, I think. But okay,
better to make it a monopoly and be done with it. But it's never mind.
Yeah. So they of course announced the program 30 years, 30% solar power by 2030. And then they went to the Israeli electricity company and said, okay, now tell us what we need to do. Right? Which came after. And I talked to several of the engineers who worked on this project. And it turns out the numbers are staggering. Because it turns out that in order to supply 30% of Israel's power from solar, you need to build 16 gigawatt installed of solar power, which is the amount of power installed from conventional sources in Israel.
Wow.
Yes. So the same amount just to get 30%. Now, it turns out that this is an overestimate because, an underestimate, because they took a number for the capacity factor, which is slightly exaggerated. And we now know the real numbers, and the real numbers are lower than 20%. I mean, we have 20% of sunshine on average every year, but the capacity factor will be lower than that because of cloudy days and because of DC to AC conversion, which takes a little bit of your capacity. So you need to install more power than you already have.
More capacity,
and this by 50,
more generation capacity.
More generation.
Right, yeah.
This is just cannot be done.
Well, and this is the same. This is the same in the U.S. And there's these, these academics from Princeton and Stanford and other places. Oh, well, we'll just double the size of the grid. And I'm thinking, no, you won't. You don't even understand what you're talking about. But that's
right.
So then fundamentally it's a physics problem, and you're a physicist. So we can say that very clearly. It's a physics problem. It's a land use problem. It's a connection problem. So we've talked now about gas, we've talked about wind, we've talked about solar, we've been talking 45 minutes or so. I want to talk about nuclear, because you have nuclear power, you have nuclear capability in Israel. This is this is no big secret. Israel is a nuclear nation. You have the bomb, have had the bomb.
According to foreign sources.
Well, right. Yes, right. Israel has the bomb, wink, wink. No one's going to say that, confirm this is the case. But there's also a political risk there, as well, right? That Israel hasn't. Well, let me put the question this way: has the fear of a nuclear attack on a nuclear power plant been one of the reasons why Israel has not built civilian nuclear reactors for power generation?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think the reason we don't have nuclear power plant is similar to the reason why nuclear power is being shut down in Europe. And this is mainly bad public relations of nuclear energy.
Okay.
This is one. And of course, the unavoidable fact that building a nuclear power plant takes 4 years, but in Israel, governments are typically replaced every 3 years. So you need to find a politician to put his name on the suggestion. However, and this takes us back to the normalization of relations with Saudi, I think now there is a unique situation in this field. Of course, nuclear power in Israel is complicated because we are not signatories of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and probably we will not sign it.
Right.
But there is a precedent for that. India is also didn't sign the NPT, and they have nuclear power, smaller than India for sure, but the precedent is there. And the situation now geopolitically is quite unique because the Biden administration wants this normalization to happen because they want an achievement on the foreign front. The Saudis have already stated that part of their demands is a civil nuclear plan. And this will be the first Arab nation with a nuclear program. And the Israel government is pushing, or at least puts it on the table, that a condition for this to happen is that we also want a civil nuclear program without signing the NPT. And if the cards play out right, and I truly hope they will, there is a unique situation here. Now,
so just to repeat, I'm sorry, Yoni, but I want this negotiations that are ongoing with the Israelis, the U.S., and the Saudis would include then, as part of any normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, both countries would be able to stand up a civilian nuclear energy program. And
right,
I mean,
that's the hope.
Is it beyond? I mean, I've been in Saudi Arabia. It's an interesting country. I'm not really interested in going back, but it was. Is this beyond the possibility that you would see Jews and the Saudis working together on peaceful nuclear? That there could be some kind of coalition that you would see Saudis coming to Israel, or Israelis going to Saudi to work on cooperation on this kind of thing, or is that truly beyond
Well,
imagining?
I would guess that South Koreans will arrive at both Saudi Arabia and Israel and build nuclear power
Okay.
plants, right?
Right.
Because neither Saudi Arabia nor Israel, honestly, has the infrastructure, the knowledge on how to build a nuclear power plants. I mean, this is not something you just.
But it could be the Saudi, it could be the Americans, right? I mean, the Americans as vendors.
Right.
I
think that's the leverage, right? I
could
hope
be
it will be the
or
Americans.
it could be the Canadians, right? With can-do
Canadians.
reactors. So
most probably, my guesses are the French, but we're still a long way from there.
Yeah. Right.
Now, Israel.
Premature to talk about who might come in. We've got other hurdles to discuss before that. But that's interesting. I didn't realize that was part of that. So for for Israel, nuclear energy would mean more electricity security. It's part of an energy security play.
Right.
For the Saudis, it would be energy security as well. But for them, they want to quit burning as much oil for power gen so they can sell the oil on the open market. Exactly. I think that's not this is not a secret, right? But they're burning
I
2 million barrels a day or something like that in their power plants just to keep the lights on, which that's a valuable fuel that they could be replacing with with nuclear, or well, they don't have gas, of course, but they'd rather not be burning that oil if they could avoid it.
Exactly. And I think the Saudis are very pragmatic and very realistic, and they understand that no matter how much you talk about whatever net zero or decarbonization or whatever, humanity is going to keep on burning oil for as far as you can see into the future.
Right. Yeah.
They just understand it. Yeah. And they say, we want to be the suppliers of that oil. And that's a smart move, I think. So, of course, nuclear power is complicated in Israel.
Sure.
It's complicated because, again, the security situation is always important here, more so than in other places.
Right.
We also cannot, it's a small country, so we need to be extra careful in terms of safety.
Right.
And so all these things are hindering the plan. And the amazing thing is that nuclear power was not even on the table till, I would say, 3 years ago. We're talking about something completely new that is just now starting to emerge. And amazingly enough, politicians on the Israeli side are surprisingly open to the idea. So I'm extremely optimistic. I think that 30 years from now, even if we run out of natural gas, it could still be replaced by a nuclear power, and everyone will win.
Well, that's interesting. I'm intrigued by how you're talking about this, because it's not something I've given a lot of thought to. But the existing nuclear plant, the Israel research reactor that's in the Negev Nuclear Research Center near Dimona. So are you close by? You're in the Negev yourself, no?
Right. I'm close by, and I have many friends and colleagues there. It's a very, very small reactor. We're talking about kilowatts.
Yeah.
So it's not the same kind of infrastructure.
Of course. But so blue sky this for me then, Yoni. Would that be the logical place then for the Israelis to build a new reactor, a new power reactor? Would be somewhere near Dimona, somewhere that's relatively far from Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, but would not be that difficult to transmit the power because it's not a hugely long distance. But
right. So I learned that in the Israel Planning Authority, there is actually a location for a nuclear power plant.
Mm-hmm.
I will, of course, not disclose the location, but I don't think it's a secret, but it's somewhere in the desert, right? For obvious reasons.
Right.
So, which means you will not be able to use a water-cooled design, but that's fine. And it's about, I would say, 200 kilometers from Tel Aviv, from the main population. So it's a reasonable distance. We transfer electricity to those distances, and so area is not a problem. And of course, nuclear power takes a very small amount of area per the power it gives. So that's always a benefit. There are other challenges to nuclear power, which I will, of course, not. I mean, one can think about these challenges for yourself. I mean, all the security things, and we are always thinking about, again, these security issues.
Sure.
And a nuclear power plant has many steps where a problem might occur. And of course, my dream is that we will not need, these huge power plants, Kendo, whatever, in the desert, but we'll have small modular reactors inside the neighborhoods in Tel Aviv.
Well, okay, so
that's a dream, but
okay,
but
no,
I think
so that's fine. So
now,
I understand what you're saying, but so let's come back to the SMRs in just a minute. So you have 16 gigawatts of installed capacity right now. So you want to, ideally you'd start with 1 or 2 gigawatts of new nuclear, so you can displace some gas-fired generation. You're still burning coal as well, no? Some of the coal plants are still in.
So we still 20% of Israel power is still coal,
right?
And I mean, the plan was to phase it out by 2025. This will not happen.
Right.
But maybe by 2027 it will. And of course, Israel will always have some coal capabilities, because coal has the unique property that it's very, very easy to store. Right? Just make a big pile of coal, and it's there. So we will always maintain the capabilities of coal generation, but for the day-to-day, everyday use, probably in a few years we'll phase out. I mean, coal was phased out in 10 years from 95% down to 20%.
Right. And just to review, because I remember some of this history, and I've been to South Africa just once there, but Israel and a lot of your coal in years past came from South Africa. Is that not right?
Still does.
The South Africans and the Israelis were closely allied because of the South Africans could provide oil and other products through the Fischer-Tropsch process, because they were experts at converting coal into other products. But so just to people who don't know the Israeli geography, I certainly didn't, and just got pulled the map up. So Dimona and the Negev is almost due south of Jerusalem. It's not quite in the middle of the country, but it's in the desert there. And so you're saying SMRs would be a more logical situation. Why wouldn't you just say, well, let's build gigawatt scale reactors like they're doing in Abu Dhabi, or the Vogel reactors here, the AP1000? Why wouldn't you want to just go ahead and build a large power station instead of SMRs, or gang up several SMRs that are gas cooled instead of water cooled, and that would work in the desert? Well, I'm just curious why you're biased toward the modular reactors in a place like Israel.
Right. So of course there's an ongoing debate between the few people who are advocating for nuclear power, what kind of nuclear power Israel should think about. Right. And I don't think there's a consensus on that. And of course, I'm optimistic. So I'm talking about something which is not yet there, right? Sure. We don't have a small modular reactors to buy. So one obvious thing is that small modular reactors will have passive safety measures.
Right.
They will be completely safe, so there's no problem in deploying them very close to the areas of major population, and this saves a lot of trouble.
Right.
For transmitting, and transmission lines in Israel are also a huge problem. I mean, for various reasons. So
because of land use conflicts.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's always a problem. I would say the second thing is that although the Israeli grid is expanding, I mean, we need more and more power every year, about 2% increase in the in generation every year. Some models show that 1.5 gigawatts are too much of a jump. So from the economic point of view, you will have to shut down the gas competitors.
I see.
So that depends on how you can sell the extra gas that you're saving.
I see.
So like everything, in the world of energy, it's a complicated problem.
Right. Or compensate the existing generators to say, we're going to buy you out and replace you with nuclear or whatever. Right.
Exactly. Now,
so then those increments of new nuclear would make more sense if they were in the 100 or 300 megawatt size or something like that, that then you could scale and gradually increase into their penetration into the Israeli grid. So one of the last things, we've been talking for about an hour. My guest is my new friend, Yonatan Dubi. He is a chemistry professor at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. He lives near Dimona in Israel. What about the Climate Act in Israel? I mean, there's a lot of now this, in Europe, there's a big backlash against the net zero push, in Britain as well. The Inflation Reduction Act here in the U.S. was passed a year ago, and a lot of cheerleading around that somehow this is going to absolutely change the global, what's happening globally in terms of climate change. I was in Japan earlier this year, and energy security was trumping any discussions about climate change. How is the Israeli government, amidst all these other things with the Supreme Court and the courts and Netanyahu's troubles and the Golan, how important is this issue of emissions reductions in Israeli politics?
Right. That strongly depends on the government that is on the administration. So the previous administration was a very strong proponent of reduction, but they could not pass a climate act.
Right. And this was the ruling party it's the Likud is in power now, right? Or
right now is the Likud is a middle right wing.
Right. But headed by Netanyahu.
Exactly. But the prior government was a coalition of both middle left, middle right, and hard left wing coalition.
Right.
And the hard left wing pushed very strongly for a climate act, but they could not pass it because I think a lot of people in government understand that passing a climate act comes at the expense of energy security and energy prices. Right. And the thing is that in Israel, energy security is okay because we have natural gas. I don't think anyone is worried about adding, 10 or 12% more solar power to the grid in terms of stability of the grid. However, the prices will skyrocket. Right. And Israel is already a fairly expensive place to live. So this is an important thing. So no government is willing to sign a law that will increase the electricity bills by a factor of 1.5 or by a factor of 2 or by a factor of 3. We don't know because, as I said, these are very high subsidies.
Right.
So they could not pass it. And now in this current government, current administration, they tried to pass a climate act. And this climate act was really even worse than the climate act of the left-wing government that was prior to that, because they were talking about 50% renewables in 20 years, things which are just, simply engineeringly cannot be done. And it did not put a cap on how much spending would this require, and gave, for example, complete control of every large infrastructure project in Israel to the Israeli EPA, Environmental Protection Agency.
Right.
So these are things which are politically dangerous because it means that every infrastructure project, everything will be first and foremost be looked at from the lens of, is it costing us additional carbon dioxide emissions?
Right.
Now, of course, everything costs carbon dioxide emissions, right? That's the almost law of current existence.
Sure.
So when you look at everything through that lens, you're going to slow down every process. And by extension, you're going to slow down the economy. Everything will cost more. Everything will take longer. It's just a bad idea. And so
and it would empower bureaucracy rather than the legislature to enact the rules, which I think is also very dangerous. But that's another,
exactly. And I mean, and we pointed out that if you state by law that the government must reduce carbon emissions to, I don't know, 50%, 20 years from now, people can sue the government for not achieving this goal, right?
Wow.
Through the Supreme Court. Now, you cannot achieve this goal.
Yeah.
Physically, you cannot achieve this goal. No one has. And so it's a dangerous opening for a bad administration, bureaucrats taking over every decision the government wants to do by looking through the lens of the environment and CO2 emissions, something like that. So it was a really bad law. It was pushed very hard by the Biden administration, and it's still being pushed. And we stopped the first round of votes literally by using political influence that the Israeli Forum for National Environmentalism has inside the Likud parties and other parties. The Minister for Environment Protection received something like 50,000 text messages or something like that, some ridiculous number, I don't know.
Right.
And it was withdrawn from the table, but it will come back. It will come back in some way or some form or another. I don't know what will happen, but I think that the Biden administration is strongly pushing for a climate act by as many countries as possible.
So I want. Pardon me for interrupting. So you're saying that the Biden administration is pushing the Likud to pass a climate measure? Okay, well, this is news to me. I had no idea. Well, right. But I guess it makes a certain amount of sense.
They want to come to the next COP meeting, the next climate convention. They want to come with as many Western countries as they can, having a climate act.
I see.
But
right, it's like they haven't done enough damage in the U.S. They want to share the
I tend to agree with that statement. Right, but they're having a huge pushback from the Israeli government, from the Israeli populace, from countries in Europe, which are now, Sweden is opposing climate act. Italy, Hungary, large places in Europe are pushing back on these because they came to realize that climate policy comes at the expense of energy security.
Right. Yeah, and this is that was what we saw in what I heard directly from Japanese government officials. Energy security is our top priority. This is the home of the Kyoto Protocol, and they were saying, okay, net zero, climate change, but we live in a bad neighborhood, and they're pointing to China, Russia, the North Koreans, Israel.
Exactly. Actually, there are quite a few analogies between Israel and Japan. It's a slightly bigger economy than Israel.
Right.
I mean, we are probably less people than live in Tokyo, but in terms of geopolitics, there are some similarities, and I wish our government would follow the Japanese example.
Well, it's interesting because, so to be clear, though, the Japanese government, a lot of local governments are saying, "Oh yes, net zero." They're nodding and saying, "Oh, this is what we're going to do." But the reality, when you ask them, that's just posturing, right? We're not
and they're reviving their nuclear plan,
reviving, and also building coal-fired power plants, by the way, and gas-fired power plants.
Power,
right? So last two questions, Yoni. I think you listen to the podcast, so you may already be expecting these. So what are you reading? What are the books that are on the top of your book pile? I know you're a busy man with 4 children, but I'm assuming you find time to read.
I do. I always read science fiction. So I'm an avid science fiction reader. I always have an Asimov book next to my bed, but I'm currently reading a book called I'm looking for the English translation, an ode to Leibowitz, I think it's called an ode to Leibowitz.
Okay.
It's a book from the 50s. It's very, very smart. It's a very so
And
I strongly recommend
you're a
it.
fan of Isaac Asimov.
Oh yeah.
So,
Oh yes.
well, he only
I'm
wrote 400 books. So you bet.
I think more than that. Yes. I think I've read a fair share of those.
Wow.
Not all, but probably the majority of those I've read.
Wow.
Yeah.
No kidding. I have not done that, but
I've been doing that for 40 years. So yeah.
Okay. Well, so last question, Yoni, what gives you hope?
Almost everything gives me hope. I'm optimistic by design. I'm always, I see the pushback from thinking people to climate policy. You give me hope, for example, your podcast and podcasts like, Decouple and Mark Mills and others that bring reason back to the table. So that gives me tremendous hope. And I'm also, being a physicist, I understand that you cannot bend the rules of the laws of physics to your wishes. So I'm always hopeful because I understand that no matter what happens, eventually reality will prevail and people will come to their senses. So I'm optimistic that way.
Well, that's a good place to stop. My guest has been Yonatan Dubi, my new friend. He is a chemistry professor at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. You can find him by just searching on the Google. He has a really interesting essay up on Substack at hxstem.substack.com. That's hxstem.substack.com. Yonatan, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. I'm glad we made this happen. There's a lot of interesting politics in Israel. Of course, the politics in Israel are always interesting because it is full contact sport in Israel, as you will know. But many thanks for joining us on the Power Hungry podcast.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me, Robert. A great opportunity.
And to all of you out there in podcast land, thanks for tuning into this episode of the Power Hungry podcast. Until next time, see ya.